There is a layer of clay roughly 2.5 meters thick beneath the ruins of Ur, and for almost 100 years now it has been quietly asking a question that biblical readers and archaeologists keep circling back to. The man who found it, Leonard Woolley, was not looking for the flood. He was digging through the Royal Cemetery in 1929, peeling back the centuries of one of the oldest cities on Earth, when his workers cut through a band of sterile silt that should not have been there. Above it, a civilization. Below it, another civilization. Different pottery, different tools, different hands. Stratigraphy is a stubborn witness. It does not argue, it only records what fell, and when, and in what order. And what fell at Ur, somewhere in that early Mesopotamian darkness, was enough water and silt and sediment to bury one human world and seal it off from the next. Woolley wrote his wife that night and told her, in plain words, that he believed he had found the flood. That is where this story has to begin. Not with thunder, not with rain, with a band of pale clay between two human worlds. Most retellings of the pre-flood era rush past the dirt and reach for the spectacle. Giants, angels, wickedness, the ark riding the waters. But the dirt matters. The dirt is where the question lives, because if Genesis is describing a real rupture in human history, not a fable, not a moral allegory, but a rupture, then we should expect the earth itself to carry the seam. And in places like Ur and Kish and Shuruppak, the seam appears to be there, written in silt, waiting to be read. There is a temptation to make this opening louder than it needs to be, to promise revelations, to hint that what comes next will overturn everything. That is not the path here. The path here is slower and, in the end, stranger, because the deeper you read into Genesis chapters 4 through 9, the less it reads like a folk tale, and the more it reads like the report of a witness trying to describe a civilization that no one alive has seen. A civilization with cities and music and metalworking. A civilization whose people lived for centuries. A civilization that, by the time the rain began, had crossed some line from which it could not return. And the question this episode wants to sit with is not whether the flood happened in the way Genesis describes. The question is what kind of world existed before it, and how that world unmade itself. Chapter 1. The clay beneath Woolley's clay was not an isolated find. In the decades that followed, similar flood deposits surfaced at Kish, at Shuruppak, at Nineveh, and at Lagash, not identical, not perfectly synchronized, but repeating. Layers of waterborne silt cutting through occupation levels that had otherwise stretched on, generation after generation, in continuous habitation. Something had pushed through the floodplain. Something had drowned settlements that had stood for centuries, and then, above the silts, life resumed. Different, reorganized, but resumed. The archaeologists who came after Woolley were more cautious than he was. Some argued the layers represented separate local floods, not one global event. Some pointed out that the silt at Kish did not seem to match the silt at Ur in date. Others suggested that what Mesopotamia preserved was the memory of one or several enormous regional inundations, magnified into cosmic scale by the cultures that survived them. These are legitimate readings. The text of the earth does not interpret itself, but there is another way to hold the evidence. The flood traditions across the ancient Near East are not vague. They share specific architecture, a divine warning, a righteous man, a boat, a pairing of animals, a release of birds, a landing on a mountain, a sacrifice, a covenant. The Sumerian account of Zusudra, the Akkadian account of Atrahasis, the Babylonian Gilgamesh tablet with its survivor Utnapishtim, and the Hebrew account of Noah. These are not four versions of the same myth, borrowed from one source. They are four cultures preserving the same shape of an event from four different angles. The shape is too specific to be coincidence and too distributed to be plagiarism. What the clay at Ur testifies to, then, is not proof. Proof is too strong a word for stratigraphy. What it testifies to is the possibility that the texts are describing something that actually happened, and that the texts, in their stubborn agreement about a man, a boat, and a flood, may be older and closer to the event than scholars long assumed. Mesopotamia is the right place for this story to land. The Hebrew word used in Genesis for the region, the land between the rivers, corresponds to the world the Sumerians and Akkadians built, the floodplain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Genesis names 4 rivers that flowed out from Eden, and 2 of them carry names we still use today. Whatever Eden was, and wherever it sat, the writer of Genesis 2 located it in the geography we now call Iraq. That is not a coincidence to be smoothed over. It is a geographic anchor. The Bible is not pointing at a vague garden somewhere east of meaning. It is pointing at a specific watershed, and in that watershed, civilization rose with an abruptness that has puzzled archaeologists for more than a century. Eridu, traditionally remembered as the first city, appears in the record already complex. Uruk, the great city of Gilgamesh, develops monumental architecture and the first known writing system in what looks, from the dig sites, like a single explosion of cultural output. There are no clear proto-stages for cuneiform. There are no clear proto-stages for the wheel. There is no slow climb. The lights come on, and the city is already there. Some scholars argue this is an illusion of preservation, that the earliest stages existed but did not survive. Others argue that something was transmitted, that Mesopotamian civilization inherited rather than invented. The Genesis text suggests the second reading. By the time Cain builds the first city in chapter 4, urban life is already present. By the time Tubal-Cain hammers bronze and iron in the same chapter, metallurgy is already present. By the time Jubal lifts the harp and the flute, music is already present. The book of Genesis describes a humanity that did not slowly stumble into civilization. It describes a humanity that arrived with it. This is where the clay layer beneath stops being a curiosity and becomes a question. If a sophisticated pre-flood world existed in this exact region, and if a catastrophic inundation cut it off from the world that came after, then what we are seeing at Ur and Kish and Shuruppak is exactly what we would expect to see. A line in the ground. A break in the record, a civilization above and a civilization below, separated by a band of pale silt that nobody can quite explain away. The answer is not certainty. The answer is that the dirt, when you read it carefully, does not contradict the text. It rhymes with it. Chapter 2, a world that did not forget. There is a line in Genesis 5 that almost no one stops on. Adam lived 930 years and he died. Seth lived 912 years and he died. Enosh 905. Kenan 909. Eol 895. Jared 962. Methuselah 969. Lamech 777. Noah 977. Noah 908. They look ornamental. They look like a literary device. Ancient kings were often given inflated lifespans in mythic literature, and so the assumption forms quickly that this is something similar, a genre marker, a way of saying these were great men. Move on, but pause for a moment with what those numbers would actually mean if they meant what they say. A man who lives 900 years is not just a long-lived man. He is a different kind of civilizational unit. He is a different kind of civilizational unit. He is a continuous witness. He is the great-grandfather of his own great-grandchildren, and the eyewitness teacher of his own great-grandchildren's craft. He can refine a skill for 4 centuries before passing it on. He can hold a memory of an event across spans of time that modern societies require entire institutions to preserve. Think of what this does to the transmission of knowledge. In our world, knowledge has to be written down. It has to be written down. It has to be taught. It has to survive death, and death is constant. Every generation loses what the last generation forgot to record. We build libraries and universities and archives precisely because human life is short and human memory is fragile. We are a species that constantly forgets and constantly rebuilds, and the gap between what one generation knows and what the next inherits is one of the great quiet tragedies of being mortal. Now imagine a world in which that gap does not exist. If Adam lives 930 years and his son Seth lives 912, and Seth's son Enosh lives 905, then the pre-flood world is a world without generational amnesia. Adam is alive when his great-great-great-great-grandsons are adults. He can tell them in his own voice what the garden looked like. He can describe the cherubim at the gate. He can teach them what he learned, and they will not need to write it down because he will still be there to repeat it for another 300 years. That is not a literary embellishment. That is a different model of civilization. There is a striking parallel here that comes from outside the Bible. The Sumerian king list, copied and recopied across Mesopotamia in the 3rd and 2nd millennia before Christ, gives the reigns of the kings of the world from the moment kingship descended from heaven. The pre-flood kings reign for tens of thousands of years each. Alulim, the first king, reigns 28,800 years. Alalauga reigns 36,000. The numbers are astronomical, and then, partway through the list, comes a line that simply reads, "The flood swept over." After that line, the reigns shrink. Centuries become decades. The kings of the post-flood world live and die on a scale recognizable to us. You do not have to accept the Sumerian numbers at face value to notice what the text is doing. It is preserving the memory of a sharp break. A world before the flood in which lives were vast. A world after the flood in which lives became short. The same architecture of memory appears in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, where the lifespans drop from nearly 1,000 years in the line of Seth to under 200 in the line of Shem within 15 generations. Two independent traditions in two different languages, written down by two different cultures, agreeing on the same arc. Something changed. Something in the conditions of human life changed, and changed permanently, somewhere between the Antediluvian world and the world we now inhabit. We will come back to what that something might have been. For now, hold the thought of a civilization without amnesia. A civilization where the first man could still be consulted in the lifetime of the man who would eventually build the ark. Methuselah, by the chronology of Genesis 5, dies the same year the flood begins. He is the last living bridge to a humanity that walked in Eden, and his death and the breaking of the waters arrive together. That detail is not in the text by accident. There is a kind of weight to that arrangement that the modern eye misses. The man whose name has by some readings been understood to mean something like, "When he dies, it comes," Methuselah, outlives every ancestor and dies in the year the rain falls. The longest life in the Bible is also the life that marks the end of an age. Chapter 3. The line of Cain and the birth of the city. Genesis. Chapter 4 does something that most readers, in their haste, walk past. It tells you, in the span of a few verses, that the entire material foundation of human civilization was already in place before the flood, not in seed form, not in seed form, not as potential, in place. Cain, after his exile, builds a city and names it for his son, Enoch. The text does not call this a settlement or a camp. It uses the Hebrew word Ir, which is the same word used later for Jericho and Hebron, and the great wall centers of the ancient Near East. A city, walls, streets, organization. The first murderer becomes the first urban planner, and the text holds the irony without explaining it. 6 generations later, in the line of Cain, 3 brothers are named. Each one is the father of something. Jabal is the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, organized pastoral life, the management of herds, the rhythms of seasonal migration. Jubal is the father of all who play the harp and the flute, music, performance, the cultural arts, the human voice extended through wood and string and breath. And Tubal-Cain is the forger of every cutting instrument of bronze and iron. That last detail is the one that should stop the reader cold. Conventional archaeology places the beginning of bronze metallurgy somewhere around 4,000 years before Christ, with iron coming much later, around 1,200 years before Christ. Iron is a late technology. It requires temperatures that early furnaces could not easily reach. It requires the ability to control oxygen and carbon in ways that took humanity, by the conventional timeline, thousands of years to develop. And yet here, in Genesis 4, in the line of Cain before the flood, the text says bronze and iron in the same breath. Some readers treat this as anachronism. The writer of Genesis, they suggest, projected later metallurgy backward into the antediluvian world because he had no other framework. Others read it differently. They read it as a claim. The claim is that the pre-flood world possessed knowledge that the post-flood world had to rediscover from scratch. The same way the city had to be rebuilt, the same way writing had to be reinvented. Iron was not new in the Iron Age. Iron was rediscovered. The forge of Tubal-Cain went under the silt with everything else. You do not have to accept that reading to feel its weight. The text is presenting a civilization that knew what it was doing, not primitives huddled around fires, people with cities and herds and music and forges. The line of Cain is not a savage line, it is a sophisticated line, and that, in the structure of Genesis, is part of the tragedy. Because the same chapter that gives us the city and the harp and the bronze also gives us Lamech. Lamech is the seventh from Adam in the line of Cain, and he is the first man in the Bible to take 2 wives. He stands before his wives, Ada and Zillah. The text names them, which itself is unusual. Women are rarely named in genealogies, and he sings a song. The song is brutal. He says he has killed a man for wounding him and a boy for striking him. He says that if Cain was avenged 7-fold, Lamech will be avenged 77-fold. He has built a moral arithmetic in which his life is worth 11 times more than his ancestors, and any insult against him deserves death. The song is given in poetic parallelism. It is the first piece of recorded human poetry in the Bible, and it is a poem about vengeance. The structure of Genesis 4 is doing something deliberate here. It is showing you a civilization that has everything: cities, music, metal, organized economy, poetry, and showing you that alongside all of this, the moral architecture has gone wrong. Cain founded the city. By the 7th generation, the city produces a man who turns murder into verse and brags about it to his wives. The technology raced ahead. The conscience did not keep pace. This is the silent argument running underneath the antediluvian narrative. It is not that the pre-flood world was primitive and brutal. It is that it was sophisticated and brutal. The brutality came with the sophistication. The knowledge accelerated, and the wisdom that should have governed the knowledge did not accelerate with it. By the time the text reaches Genesis 6, the diagnosis is total. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. That word continually is doing a lot of work. It is the Hebrew kol hayom, all the day. The corruption is not occasional. It is not episodic. It is constant. It is the air the civilization breathes. And the text makes clear that this was not a matter of a few bad actors. It was systemic. It was the water which everyone swam, the assumption underneath everything, the moral background noise of the entire human project. When a society reaches that condition, it loses the ability to see itself. That is what makes this kind of decay so dangerous. It does not feel like decay from the inside. It feels like normal life. The line of Cain did not wake up one morning and find itself wicked. It crossed the threshold gradually, generation by generation, normalizing what the previous generation would have found unthinkable. By Lamech's song, the threshold is already behind them. By Genesis 6, the threshold is so far behind that the only way out is to wash the slate clean and start again. There is something here that lands uncomfortably close to the present, not as warning. The text is not interested in warning the modern reader directly. As pattern, the pattern is that civilizations do not collapse from the outside. They collapse from a slow internal recalibration of what counts as acceptable, until the unacceptable is invisible. The flood is not the punishment of an angry deity who lost his temper. The flood is what happens when a civilization stops being able to recognize the line it has crossed. Chapter 4. The Watchers and the Daughters of Men. There is no passage in Genesis more contested, more strange, and more carefully short than the first 4 verses of chapter 6. It is 6 sentences. It introduces, without explanation, a category of being called the Bene Elohim, the sons of God, and tells the reader that they saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and that they took as wives any of them they chose. From this union, the text says, came the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Then it stops. It does not explain who the Bene Elohim are. It does not explain how the union happened. It does not explain what a Nephilim looks like. It does not explain why this story is told here on the threshold of the flood as the immediate preface to the divine decision to wipe out humanity. It tells you the fact and moves on, and 3,000 years of readers have been trying to fill in the silence ever since. Genesis 6 is one of those passages where the Bible itself tells you that something has happened without telling you what, and the reader has to make a choice. You can read it minimally. The sons of God were the line of Seth, the righteous line, who intermarried with the line of Cain, the wicked line, and the result was the moral corruption of the godly. This reading has been held by serious theologians for centuries. It keeps the cosmos tidy. There are no angels in it. There are no half-divine offspring. There are only humans making bad marriages. You can read it cosmically. The sons of God are angelic beings, members of the divine council, and they cross a boundary that should not have been crossed, taking human women as wives and producing offspring of a different order. This reading is older than the minimal one, and it is the reading the New Testament writers seem to assume. Jude and the second letter of Peter both refer to angels who left their proper dwelling, who did not keep their first estate, and who are now bound in chains until judgment. They are clearly thinking of Genesis 6. They are clearly reading it cosmically. The question is older than the New Testament. The Book of Enoch, written in the centuries between the Testaments, gives the cosmic reading its fullest expression. It names the leaders of the rebel angels. 200 of them, the text says, descended on the summit of Mount Hermon and swore an oath together to take human wives. Their leader is named Samjaza. They are called Watchers because their original role was to watch over humanity, and instead they entered into it. They taught humanity, the Book of Enoch says, the things that should not have been taught. Metallurgy of weapons, cosmetics and seduction, astrology and magic, the cutting of roots for sorcery, the reading of the stars for divination. Notice the shape of what is being described. It is not random sin. It is the transfer of a particular kind of knowledge. The same knowledge, in fact, that Genesis 4 attaches to the line of Cain. Metallurgy, cultural enhancement, the arts of self-presentation and self-amplification. The Watchers, in the Enochic tradition, do not corrupt humanity by introducing entirely new desires. They corrupt humanity by giving it tools that exceed its moral capacity to use them. That is a precise and unsettling kind of fall. It is not the fall of ignorance into knowledge. It is the fall of small wisdom into great power. The Book of Enoch is not scripture in most canons. The Ethiopian Church preserves it. The early Christian writers quote it. The Book of Jude in the New Testament cites it by name. But the major canonical traditions, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, set it outside the bounds of accepted scripture. So one has to read it carefully. It is a witness to how ancient Jewish readers understood Genesis 6, but it is not Genesis 6 itself. The 4 verses of Genesis remain spare, and the elaboration in Enoch is exactly that, an elaboration. What Genesis itself says is this: the sons of God came to the daughters of men. The Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also afterward. They were mighty. They were renowned. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The placement matters. The corruption of Genesis 6:5 follows immediately on the union of Genesis 6:5 follows immediately on the union of Genesis 6:1-4. The text does not explicitly say one caused the other, but the structure suggests it. Something has happened to humanity, the text is saying. Something has gone wrong at a level deeper than mere choice. Something has entered the human story that should not have been there, and the result is the total corruption diagnosed in verse 5. Some scholars push back. They argue that the Nephilim are simply a class of warrior elites, men of unusual size or military reputation, and that the union of Genesis 6 is the union of two human lines, not of two orders of being. They point out that the word Nephilim shows up again in Numbers 13, where the Israelite spies report seeing them in Canaan, which suggests they cannot have all died in the flood, and which suggests they are a human phenomenon, however unusual. This is a real argument and worth holding, but the older reading, the cosmic reading, holds something else. It holds that the line between heaven and earth, between the realm of the divine counsel and the realm of human flesh, was crossed before the flood in a way that contaminated the human stock itself. And it holds that the flood, when it came, was not only a moral cleansing but a biological one, a purging of a lineage that should never have existed. You do not have to decide between these readings today. The text leaves room for disagreement, and serious readers have disagreed for 2 millennia. What you do have to notice is that Genesis 6 is not a casual passage. Whatever happened in those 4 verses, it was severe enough that the next thing the text records is the divine decision to end the world. The Ben Elohim, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, these are not curiosities. They are the immediate prelude to the flood. They are part of the diagnosis, and the diagnosis is that humanity, by the time the rain came, was no longer purely human. In some sense, the text does not feel obligated to fully define. Whether that means morally, culturally, or biologically, or some combination of all three, is the question the passage leaves on the table. What it does not leave on the table is the conclusion. The conclusion is that the entire arrangement had to end. Chapter 5, one word for Noah, Genesis 6 verse 9, is one of those sentences that, in English, slides past the reader without leaving a mark. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. The English word blameless is doing a lot of work that the Hebrew underneath it does not quite let it do. The Hebrew word is tamim, and tamim is not a moral word, not primarily. Tamim is the word used in the book of Leviticus to describe the animals brought for sacrifice. An animal that is tamim is an animal without blemish, without defect, without injury, without contamination. It is whole in its physical integrity. It is unmixed. It is what it is supposed to be. When the writer of Genesis applies tamim to Noah, he is reaching for that word. Not the word for moral uprightness, though tamim can imply that. Not the word for piety, though piety is in the neighborhood. He reaches for the word that means uncontaminated. This is one of those moments where the original language opens a door that translation tends to close. Because if tamim means what it means in Leviticus, unblemished, unmixed, intact, then the statement that Noah was tamim in his generation is making a specific claim. It is saying that Noah, in the generation of the Nephilim, in the generation of the B'nai Elohim, in the generation of the corruption of all flesh, had remained what humanity was originally supposed to be. He was still in his lineage undivided. He was still what Adam had been. That reading is not the only reading. Many serious Hebrew scholars hold that tamim here means morally upright and nothing more, that the sacrificial connotation is being overread. The text says, after all, that Noah walked with God, the same phrase used of Enoch in chapter 5, and that phrase is clearly a moral and spiritual one, not a biological one. The minimal reading is that Noah was a righteous man in a wicked age, and the word tamim is borrowed from the sacrificial vocabulary to emphasize the completeness of his righteousness, nothing more. But there is a verse half a line later that pushes back on the minimal reading. Genesis 6 verse 12. God looks upon the earth, and he sees that all flesh, kobasah in the Hebrew, had corrupted its way upon the earth. The word for corrupted is shechet, and it does not only mean morally corrupt, it means ruined, it means spoiled, it means destroyed, it means destroyed. And the phrase all flesh extends the diagnosis beyond humanity to the animal kingdom itself. Something had ruined the flesh of the earth. The ancient Jewish readers who developed the Watchers tradition took this seriously. They held that the corruption was not metaphorical, that the union of the B'nai Elohim with the daughters of men had introduced a biological contamination into the line of Adam, and that the only reason the flood could not simply wash away the wicked, but had to wash away nearly everything, was because the corruption had penetrated the human stock and the animal stock alike. Noah and his sons were preserved not only because they were righteous, but because they were still, in the original sense, human. That reading is severe. It does not sit comfortably in modern theology. It implies a category of being that no longer exists, a kind of contamination that the modern world has no framework for. But it is the reading that makes the strongest sense of why the flood had to be what it was. A localized moral judgment could have been accomplished by simpler means. The destruction of nearly all flesh on earth, including animals who had committed no sin, required a more total contamination than mere wickedness can produce. The text does not force you to choose. It gives you to meme and walks away. It says all flesh had ruined its way, and it lets you draw your own conclusions about what that means. What it does do, with great care, is hold Noah apart. Noah is named. His sons are named. His wife and his sons' wives are mentioned, though not named. 8 souls, that is the count. 8 souls in a world of millions. The text is not interested in the millions. It is interested in the 8. And of the 8, the one given the word tamim is Noah. There is something deeply moving in this, even apart from the theological debates. The man who survives is not the strongest. He is not a warrior, not a king, not a hero in the Greek sense. He builds a boat for over 100 years while the world around him goes on with its business. He has no signs. He has no miracles. He has only an instruction from a God who has spoken to him directly, and he carries out the instruction year after year while his neighbors presumably wonder what is wrong with the old man who keeps cutting timber for a vessel that no rain has ever justified. The genealogies tell us Noah was 500 years old when his sons were born and 600 when the flood came. 100 years of building, 100 years of explaining or refusing to explain, 100 years of being the man who took God's warning literally when no one else did. This is the kind of detail that gets lost when the flood is reduced to its disaster footage. The flood, in Genesis, is preceded by a 100-year-long act of patient obedience by one man. And a word the text uses for him, the word that defines him, is the word for an animal fit for the altar, unblemished, whole, intact. Whatever Noah was, in whatever sense Genesis means it, he was what the rest of the human race was no longer. Chapter 6, when the windows of heaven opened. The description of the flood itself in Genesis 7 is shorter than most readers remember. It happens in roughly 40 verses. The earth has been corrupted, the ark has been built, the animals have come in, and then the text gives the chronology. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day, and the Hebrew here is emphatic, Bayom Hazeh, on this very day, the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened. 2 sources of water. That is the first thing to notice. Not just rain, not just clouds. 2 sources. Below and above. The fountains of the deep, Chehom in the Hebrew. The same word used in Genesis 1 for the primordial waters that the Spirit of God hovered over at the beginning. Burst open, and the windows of heaven. The same windows referenced in Genesis 1 verse 7, when God divided the waters above the firmament from the waters below, were opened. The text is doing something architectural here. It is referring back to the creation account in chapter 1, where the world was constructed as a kind of bubble with waters held back above and below, and saying that on the day the flood came, the bubble broke. The waters above came down, the waters below came up, and the world that had existed in the protected space between them was inundated. This is where one of the more interesting interpretive traditions enters, the vapor canopy hypothesis. It is not a creedal position. It is not in the text explicitly. It is a reading that some scholars and theologians, particularly in the last century, have developed to make sense of 2 features of the Genesis account that otherwise sit awkwardly together. The first feature is the language in Genesis 1 about waters above the firmament. Whatever the writer of Genesis 1 thought the firmament was, he placed water on the other side of it. Some scholars argue this is purely cosmological, an ancient Near Eastern cosmology where the sky was a solid dome holding back celestial waters. Others have suggested it might describe a real physical condition, a dense layer of water vapor surrounding the pre-flood Earth, held aloft by atmospheric pressure or by some condition we no longer experience. The second feature is Genesis 2 verse 6, which says that before the flood, a mist rose from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Not rain, mist. The text seems to be telling us that the pre-flood atmosphere was hydrologically different from the post-flood atmosphere. Water cycled differently. The ground was watered from below by some kind of subterranean moisture system rather than from above by precipitation. If you put these two features together, you get a picture of a world enclosed in a vapor canopy. Higher atmospheric pressure, more uniform climate, no rain in the modern sense, and critically, far more shielding from solar and cosmic radiation than we now experience. What would such a world produce? Several things, the proponents of the hypothesis argue. It would produce a more stable greenhouse, with tropical conditions extending much further toward the poles, which fits the fossil evidence of subtropical plant life found in Arctic regions. It would produce larger living organisms, because higher oxygen and higher pressure favor gigantism, which fits the fossil evidence of enormous insects and reptiles. And it would produce dramatically longer lifespans, because the rate of cellular damage from radiation and cosmic exposure would be much lower. The hypothesis is not without its problems. Atmospheric scientists have raised serious objections to whether a vapor canopy of the proposed density could have been physically stable. The thermodynamic effects of releasing such a canopy in the form of 40 days and 40 nights of rain would have produced temperatures incompatible with biological survival. Many young Earth and old Earth scholars now consider the canopy model untenable in its strong form, but the underlying intuition the hypothesis tries to honor is harder to dismiss. Something in the conditions of the pre-flood world allowed for what the text describes: long lifespans, mist-based hydrology, a different relationship between the earth and the waters above, and something in the flood changed those conditions permanently. Whether the change was a vapor canopy collapsing or a different atmospheric chemistry or some other shift, the text insists that the world after the flood is not the world before it. When the rain finally fell, it fell for 40 days. The waters from below rose for 150 days before they began to recede. The ark floated for over 5 months on a flooded world. The text says the waters covered the highest mountains by more than 15 cubits. That is around 7 meters above the highest peaks visible to Noah. Whatever that means, geographically, whether the mountains of the pre-flood world were smaller than today's, or whether the language is referring to the highest peaks of the local region, the text describes a totality. The land disappeared, and then, slowly, it came back. The text is careful about this. The waters receded. The ark rested on the mountains of Ararat in the 7th month. The tops of the mountains became visible in the 10th month. Noah waited. He sent out a raven, which did not return. He sent out a dove, which came back. He sent out the dove again, and it came back with an olive leaf. He sent it a 3rd time, and it did not return. Then he removed the covering of the ark, and saw that the face of the ground was dry. There is an almost ritualistic patience in this sequence. Noah does not rush out. He waits for the world to be ready. The text gives every detail of the timing, as if the writer wants the reader to feel the length of the waiting. The waters did not just go away. They were gone in stages. The world was not just re-emerging. It was being remade, slowly, methodically, while Noah and his family floated in the only refuge that survived. When he finally steps out, the first thing he does is build an altar. He offers a sacrifice from every clean animal and every clean bird. And the text says that the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart that he would never again curse the ground because of man, even though the inclination of the human heart is evil from his youth. Even though the condition that justified the flood has not disappeared, the human heart is still inclined toward evil, but the divine response will not be another flood. The rainbow comes after. The covenant comes after. And what the rainbow signifies in the text is not just God's promise to humanity, it is God's binding of himself. A covenant, in the ancient sense, is a mutual obligation. The rainbow is the sign that the Creator has placed a limit on his own response to human evil. The flood will not happen again. Whatever else happens, the waters will not return. That is a quieter ending than most readers expect. The flood does not end in vengeance vindicated. It ends in something closer to grief. God will work with the broken material that remains. He will not destroy it again. The condition has not changed. The response has. Chapter 7. The shorter years after the genealogies after the flood tell a story that almost no one stops to read carefully, but it is one of the most important stories in the Bible, hidden in Numbers. Shem, Noah's son, lived 600 years. Arpachshad, Shem's son, lived 480. Arpachshad, Shem's son, lived 438. Shelah, 433. Eber, 464. Peleg, 239. Ru, 239. Serug, 230. Nahor, 148. Terah, 255. Abraham, 175. The trend is unmistakable. From the moment the ark opens, the human lifespan begins to fall. By Peleg, 4 generations after Shem, it has dropped below half. By Nahor, 8 generations after Shem, it has dropped below 150. By the time the genealogy reaches Abraham, the lifespan is recognizably modern in its order of magnitude, long by our standards, patriarchal even, but no longer the millennia of the pre-flood world. The decline takes only about 15 generations to complete. Whatever happened at the flood, it did not only happen to the earth, it happened to human biology. If the vapor canopy hypothesis is wrong in its specifics, the pattern it tried to explain remains. Something shifted. The post-flood atmosphere, the post-flood radiation environment, the post-flood food sources, the post-flood genetic conditions, something, or some combination of somethings, changed the rate at which humans aged, and the change was not gradual, in the way evolutionary change is gradual. It happened on a timescale that the text records in generations, not in epochs. Some readers argue this is a literary device. The numbers, they say, are theological rather than biological. They are tracing a symbolic decline, not a measurable one. This is a respectable reading, but it requires the numbers to be invented, and the numbers are remarkably specific. They are not round. They do not follow obvious symbolic patterns. They have the shape of records, not of inventions. The other reading is that the numbers mean what they say, that the pre-flood world supported lifespans of nearly 1,000 years, and the post-flood world did not. And the transition between them is exactly what the text describes. A steady, generational decline as the biological conditions of the new Earth worked their way through the human line. Either way, the function of the text is the same. It is marking an end. Whatever the pre-flood world had been, its cities, its forges, its music, its lifespans, its strange and possibly contaminated lineages, is gone. The world that comes after is poorer in some ways. It is shorter. It is less continuous. It has lost the witness bearers, the men who could remember their own great-grandfathers' great-grandfathers in person. The civilization without amnesia is over. From now on, knowledge has to be written down. Memory has to be written down. Memory has to be entrusted to texts. And texts, the writer of Genesis seems to know, are themselves fragile. There is a quiet moment near the end of the flood narrative that often gets passed over. After Noah builds the altar and offers his sacrifice, after the covenant is established and the rainbow appears, the text turns toward farming. Noah, it says, was a man of the soil, and he was the first to plant a vineyard, and he drank of its wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. It is a strange detail to include. The man who saved humanity, the man who walked with God, the man who was Tamim in his generation, ends his story passed out in a tent. His son Ham sees him. His sons Shem and Japheth cover him without looking. When Noah wakes, he curses Canaan, the son of Ham, and the family lines that will define the post-flood world begin to fork from there. The detail is uncomfortable. It does not flatter Noah. But Genesis is not in the business of flattering anyone. The detail is there, I think, because it is honest. The man who survived the flood was still a man. The new world was not paradise restored. The same human nature that had filled the pre-flood earth with violence was still present in the 8 souls who walked off the ark. The diagnosis in Genesis 6, that the inclination of the human heart is evil from its youth, is repeated by God after the flood in Genesis 8, almost word for word. The flood did not fix what was wrong with humanity. It only removed the specific civilization that had concentrated and amplified what was wrong. That is a harder ending than the popular telling suggests. The flood is not the story of how humanity was cured. It is the story of how a particular trajectory was interrupted so that something else could begin. The new beginning is not pure. It is not without shadow. Noah gets drunk. Ham mocks. Canaan is cursed. Within a few chapters, the descendants of Noah are building a tower at Babel, trying again to reach what their ancestors had reached, trying again to gather themselves into a single project too large for their wisdom to hold. If you have read Genesis with this kind of patience before, you can probably feel where the story is going. The pattern is going to repeat in different forms, not as totally as before. The covenant of the rainbow holds, but the human tendency to outrun its own moral capacity, to gather knowledge faster than wisdom, to build cities that contain Lamechs as well as Jubals, that tendency does not go away with the flood. It re-emerges. It always re-emerges. The witness of the Antediluvian story is not that this can never happen again, it is that something like it can, and the deeper witness, beneath that one, is that integrity is possible even when the surrounding world has lost it. Noah was Tamim in his generation. That phrase is doing something the modern reader sometimes misses. It is not saying that Noah was righteous compared to a low standard. It is saying that Noah was righteous in the place where it was hardest to be. He held his ground in a generation in which the ground itself had moved. He was what he was supposed to be, in a world that had forgotten what it was supposed to be. If you have stayed with this story to the end, and the careful reading of these chapters has helped you see something you had not seen before, the channel will keep returning to texts like these, slowly, without shortcuts, without pretending the questions are easier than they are. There is one last thing worth saying, and then this telling will be done. The clay layer beneath Ur, the genealogies of Genesis 5, the Song of Lamech, the names of the watchers in the Book of Enoch, the word Tamim, the windows of heaven, the dove with the olive leaf, the shortening years after. None of these, taken alone, would prove what Genesis is saying. They sit in different registers: archaeology, philology, theology, genealogy. They do not speak the same language, but they rhyme. That is what struck the careful readers of these texts in earlier centuries, and that is what still strikes the careful readers now. The dirt at Ur rhymes with the verse in Genesis 7. The Sumerian king list rhymes with the genealogies of chapter 5. The Epic of Gilgamesh rhymes with the dove and the olive leaf. The Book of Enoch rhymes with the 4 spare verses at the beginning of Genesis 6. The drop in lifespan rhymes with the rupture of the firmament. None of these is proof in the modern legal sense. All of them together form a pattern, and the pattern is hard to make go away. Whether one reads Genesis as history, as theology, as ancient memory preserved in inspired form, or as some combination of all three, the text is not asking the reader to believe something casual. It is describing a rupture in the human story large enough to leave fingerprints on dirt, on language, on biology, and on the memory of nearly every culture that survived to write its own version of the event. The pre-flood world is gone. The civilization without amnesia is gone. The vapor above the firmament, if it ever existed, is gone. The Nephilim, by the testimony of the text itself, were in the earth in those days. And after the flood, the text adds, almost in passing, they were there afterward too, in some form. But they were no longer the ruling presence. They were no longer the architecture of the age. The age had ended. A new age, shorter lived, more fragile, more dependent on writing and on memory, and on the slow rebuilding of what had been lost, had begun. What we live in is what came after, and the story, the careful reading of the story is still capable of telling us things about ourselves that nothing else quite can. That knowledge without wisdom destroys, that civilizations collapse from within, slowly, while the people inside them think everything is fine. That integrity is not a function of the environment, but of the soul. That the Creator who closed the door of the ark behind Noah is the same one who placed the bow in the cloud and bound himself to a covenant of patience with a creation that had nearly broken his heart. The clay beneath Ur is still there. Anyone can go and see it. It does not preach. It does not argue. It only records in pale silt about 2.5 meters thick that something happened, and that the world above is not the world below. The rest of the story is in the text, and the text, when read slowly, still has the power to tell us what the clay alone cannot. That what happened was not random, that what survived was not accidental, and that the line between the world that was and the world that is runs not only through the dirt but through every human heart that still has to choose in its own generation whether to be Tamim